A stretcher wheel squealed as it hit the threshold of Bay 3, and the sound cut through the emergency department like a warning bell. Rain hammered the ambulance doors outside. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed with that tired, late-night impatience hospitals seemed to collect in their ceilings. A monitor somewhere kept chirping a steady rhythm, but the rhythm was wrong, too fast, too thin, like it could snap. And in the center of it all stood Staff Sergeant Cole Mercer, United States Marine Corps, in a damp hoodie and civilian jeans, his arms half raised as if he'd walked into a fight he didn't want, but wouldn't back away from. He wasn't yelling, that was the unsettling part. He was just standing there, jaw tight, eyes fixed on one person. A nurse in navy scrubs with her badge turned slightly inward, like she hoped the plastic could hide her name. "Pat." "Tell them," Mercer said, voice low enough that the room had to lean in to hear it. "Tell them who you really are." The nurse's throat bobbed as she swallowed. Her hands were moving, fast, practiced, adjusting a line, checking the patient's pulse, calling out numbers as if numbers could protect her from the moment. But everyone in that bay felt it. This wasn't normal staff tension. This wasn't a Marine being difficult. This was something else. Something that had been building for a long time, and now it had nowhere to go but out. At the foot of the bed, an attending physician, Dr. Harlan Wicks, lifted his chin in a small, irritated motion. He was the kind of doctor who wore authority like a pressed white coat, and he didn't like surprises. "Sergeant," Wicks said, sharp and controlled, "step back, you're interfering with care." Mercer didn't move. His gaze didn't leave Pat. And Pat, who looked like any exhausted night shift nurse in San Diego, finally flicked her eyes up. They were steady, not scared. "Just tired." "You don't want this," she murmured to Mercer, almost like a plea. Mercer's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Something bitter lived there. "I didn't want any of it," he said, "but you made me watch you take it, over and over." The patient on the bed groaned softly, not screaming, not dramatic, just a human sound. The clean, clinical kind of pain that doesn't ask permission. Pat's hands paused for half a second. And that half second was enough for Mercer to lean in, voice dropping even further. "They're about to blame you again," he said. "I can see it in his face." Wicks bristled, "Excuse me." Mercer finally turned his head, just slightly, and looked at the doctor like he was taking measurements. "If anything goes wrong in this bay," Mercer said, "you're going to point at her, you always do." The room went still, as if the air itself had been told to stop moving. Pat exhaled, long, controlled, and then to everyone's surprise, she looked at the doctor, not Mercer. "I need another set of hands," she said, perfectly professional, "and I need you to stop crowding the airway." Wick's eyes narrowed. "You don't give me orders." Pat's face didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, like an invisible weight slid off her shoulders and onto the floor. "Then don't call it an order," she said. "Call it survival." The monitor chirped again. A paramedic whispered something to another nurse. Somewhere behind the curtains, someone muttered, "Who is she?" Mercer's voice was barely audible now, but it carried. "Tell them," he repeated, "before he buries you." Pause. Earlier that evening, the city had looked like a postcard. San Diego's harbor lights had smeared across the wet pavement like melted gold. The wind off the water had that salty bite that always made Marines feel a little more awake, no matter how long they'd been up. Cole Mercer had been awake for nearly 20 hours. Not because he was out partying, not because he was reckless. Because his world had been quietly collapsing in the most ordinary way possible: paperwork, politics, and a phone call that started with, "We need to bring you in." Mercer was a logistics staff NCO at Camp Pendleton, not a door kicker anymore, not the kind of Marine people pictured when they said the word. He had scars, sure, but most of them were the kind that didn't show. He ran numbers, scheduled convoys, tracked inventories, and did it all with the same steady focus he'd once used to clear rooms. He was reliable, too reliable. The kind of man who didn't complain, which meant people assumed he never needed anything. He'd taken a rare off-base evening to meet his younger sister, Tessa, for dinner near Little Italy. Tessa was a nurse, too, newer, still bright-eyed, still believing the system was basically fair. They'd barely sat down when her phone rang. She looked at the screen and went pale. "It's the hospital," she whispered, already standing. Mercer didn't ask questions. He just stood with her, dropped cash on the table, and followed her into the wet night. On the way, Tessa tried to explain through shallow breaths. There's an incident, she said. At St. Bridget's, they said I need to come in and identify someone, but they won't tell me. Mercer's hands tightened on the steering wheel. You're not identifying anyone alone, he said. And that was how they ended up at St. Bridget Medical Center, a big private hospital perched close enough to the coast that the air inside always seemed slightly damp. St. Bridget's had money. It had glossy floors and donor plaques and a lobby fountain that never stopped running. It also had a hierarchy you could feel just by walking past the receptionist. Mercer had been there before, twice. Both times with injured Marines who'd been sent off base for specialized care. Both times he'd noticed the same thing. Some staff members treated people like human beings. Others treated them like inconveniences wearing uniforms. And then there was the emergency department. The ED didn't care about donor plaques. The ED cared about speed, control, and who was allowed to speak. That night the ED was at capacity. You could see it in the way nurses moved, quick, clipped, eyes scanning, bodies always angled toward the next task. You could hear it in the way doctors talked, short sentences, names instead of people, orders instead of questions. And right at the center of that controlled chaos was Dr. Harlan Wicks. Mercer recognized him immediately. Wicks was a rising star attending in emergency medicine. Mid-40s, perfect hair, perfect posture, the kind of guy who spoke about systems and efficiency like human beings were units of measure. He was also the kind of guy who didn't like being challenged. Pat worked under him. Mercer knew Pat too. Not personally, not at first. But if you spent enough time in a place, you noticed patterns. And Pat was a pattern breaker. She was an experienced nurse, maybe late 30s, maybe older if the lines at the corners of her eyes were from more than just the night shift. She kept her voice even. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't gossip in hallways. And because she didn't play the social game, people decided she must be weak. They were wrong. Mercer first saw Pat 6 months earlier when a Marine from his unit came in with chest pain after a training accident. The room was tense, loud, full of opinions. Pat had walked in like a quiet storm. She checked the patient, asked one question, and everything changed. She didn't argue, she didn't posture. She just moved the right way at the right time, and suddenly the room followed her. Wicks took the credit afterward. Mercer remembered that. He also remembered something else. When Mercer tried to thank Pat on the way out, he'd caught a glimpse of a thin chain around her neck disappearing beneath her scrub top. A small metal shape, hard to see but unmistakably military. A set of dog tags. That was Breadcrumb 1. Breadcrumb 2 came weeks later, when Mercer returned with paperwork for another injured Marine and passed by the nurse's station. Pat was standing there, listening to a younger nurse complain about a difficult family in Bay 2. Wicks had stepped in, smiling that polished smile, and said loudly, "Pat, you can take that. You're good at calming people down." The younger nurse snickered. Pat didn't change expression. She simply said, "I'm assigned to Bay 5. Wicks' smile thinned. "You're assigned where I say you're assigned." There was a beat, just long enough for the room to sense friction. Then Pat nodded once, understood. She walked away. No argument. No drama. But Mercer saw her hands. They were steady. Too steady for someone who was used to being pushed around. Breadcrumb 3 came the month after that. The hospital hosted a charity event for veterans. Mercer had been asked to attend in uniform because donors liked photos. In the hallway outside the auditorium, he'd seen Pat in civilian clothes, leaning against a wall as if she didn't belong. A retired Navy captain, silver hair, sharp eyes, had walked up to her. He stopped like he'd hit an invisible wall. Then he'd said quietly, "Ma'am." Pat had replied, "Captain." And for a half-second there had been something between them, recognition, respect. Then Pat had looked past him, as if she didn't want to be seen. Mercer had never forgotten that either. So when Tessa got that call, and when Mercer walked into St. Bridget's and saw the ED spinning, and when he saw Pat's name on the board beside Bay 3, something in him tightened. Because Bay 3 wasn't a normal bay. Bay 3 was the bay they used when someone important came in through the back. And when Mercer asked a passing tech who the incoming patient was, the tech hesitated and said, "We're not supposed to say." Mercer didn't like that. He liked even less when he heard Wick's voice carrying down the corridor. "Make sure security keeps non-family away," Wick said. "No photos, no disruptions." Tessa grabbed Mercer's sleeve. "Cole," she whispered. "They said there was a crash, a motorcycle. They said the rider was." Her voice broke. Mercer's brain snapped into that old, cold focus he hated and relied on. "Who is it, Tess?" he asked. Tessa swallowed hard. "It might be Pat." Mercer stared at her. "Pat, the nurse." Tessa nodded, eyes wide. "They said a staff member was hit. They said she was off shift, they said." Mercer didn't let her finish. He moved toward Bay 3 like he was walking into a firefight, except there were no weapons, just rules and people who thought rules made them untouchable. And in Bay 3, under harsh light, Pat lay on the stretcher with an oxygen mask and a pressure bandage on her shoulder. Her skin looked ashen, but her eyes were open. She wasn't panicking. She was watching. Wick stood over her like a conductor who'd forgotten the orchestra had souls. "We're going to need consent for imaging," he said, brisk, "and I need you to answer questions clearly." Pat's voice was muffled under the mask, but she managed. "I'm allergic to—" Wicks cut her off. "We'll get to that, focus on the pain scale." Mercer stepped in before he realized he was doing it. "Let her speak," he said. Wicks turned, irritated. "Who are you?" Mercer didn't puff up. He didn't flash rank like a badge. He just said, "Someone who's watched you dismiss her more than once." Wicks blinked, then laughed, just once under his breath. "This is not your workplace." Mercer's eyes flicked to Pat. She met his gaze, and for a moment he saw something he didn't expect. Not fear. A warning. Like she was asking him not to do this. But Mercer had been carrying a different kind of anger for months. The kind that comes from watching competence get stepped on because it's quiet. The kind that comes from seeing people who serve get treated like tools. And now Pat was the one on the stretcher. Now she was vulnerable. Now Wicks could rewrite the story however he wanted. Mercer wasn't going to let that happen. Not tonight. If you're already invested in where this is going, if you can feel that slow pressure building in this room, take a second and tap subscribe. These stories are fictional, but the emotions are real, and you're going to want to stay for the moment everything flips. Pause. Pat's injury wasn't cinematic. No blood-soaked dramatics, no screaming. Just the clean, clinical urgency of a body that had taken a hard impact. A motorcycle clip at low speed, someone said. A car that didn't check a blind spot. A short ride turned into a long night. Pat's shoulder was dislocated. She had bruising along her ribs, possible concussion. Nothing life-ending unless something got missed. And that was the part that made Mercer's skin prickle. Because in medicine, the worst damage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's the thing no one looks for because they're too busy proving they're in charge. Pat tried to answer Wick's questions, but Wicks kept moving the conversation like he was pushing a shopping cart. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Pat tried to respond, but the oxygen mask fogged with her breath. Mercer stepped closer. "She said she's allergic to something," he reminded. Wick's eyes flashed. "I heard her." But he hadn't written it down. Mercer saw that too. Tessa stood just outside the curtain, hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. She looked like she wanted to help but didn't know if she was allowed. That was the thing about St. Bridget's. Permission mattered more than capability. A young resident hovered nearby, eyes darting between Wicks and Pat. Another nurse, Camille, badge bright and cheerful, leaned in to whisper something to Wicks. Mercer caught a fragment. "She's always doesn't follow the chain." Wicks nodded, as if receiving confirmation of something he already believed. Pat's eyes closed for a second, and Mercer watched her shoulders tighten with controlled pain. Then she opened her eyes again and said, clearly this time, "I'm allergic to ketorolac, NSAIDs in general it causes." Wicks waved a hand, noted. He didn't look at the chart. Pat's gaze snapped to his hand, then to Mercer. That same warning again. Mercer leaned in close but kept his voice calm. "Pat," he said, "you need to tell them." Pat's eyelids fluttered. "Not here," she whispered. Mercer's jaw tightened. "Here is exactly where," he said. Wicks straightened. "That's enough security." But before the word could fully leave his mouth, the monitor chirped a different tone. A sharper one. Pat's pulse spiked. Her oxygen saturation dipped slightly. The resident's head snapped up. "She's getting tacky," he said. Wicks stepped closer, suddenly attentive. "What's happening?" Pat spoke through her mask, breath controlled. "My chest tight." Mercer saw it, the subtle shift, the small hand moving toward her ribs. Not dramatic, not staged. Real. "Wicks." Attention sharpened, but his confidence didn't. "We need a chest scan, now." Pat's eyes opened wider. "No contrast," she said quickly. "Please." Wicks frowned. "We'll decide what you need." Pat's hand tightened on the sheet. "I've had a reaction before." The resident hesitated. "We should check her allergy list." Wicks cut him off. "We don't have time to debate, she's unstable." Mercer's voice dropped. "You're about to make the same mistake you always make," he said. "You assume she's exaggerating because she's not loud enough for you." Wicks' eyes narrowed. "And you assume you know better because you wear a uniform." Mercer didn't flinch. "No," he said. "I assume she knows her own body because she's a professional." Pat's eyes squeezed shut. The resident looked uncertain. Camille whispered again, and Mercer caught it this time. "She's always acting like she's above us." Mercer felt something cold and familiar spread through his chest. Not rage. Recognition. He'd seen this before, not in hospitals necessarily, in units, in offices, anywhere a hierarchy existed and someone competent didn't play the game. Pat wasn't being targeted because she was incompetent. She was being targeted because she was harder to control. Then the paramedic who'd brought her in spoke up. "She was lucid in transport," he said, but she kept saying no contrast, said it like she meant it. Wicks' jaw clenched. For a split second, he looked like he was calculating the optics. Who was watching? Who would write what down? Then he forced a smile. "Fine," he said. "We'll do non-contrast, get her to CT." The resident exhaled in relief. Pat didn't. Her gaze flicked to Mercer, and this time it wasn't a warning. It was something else. A quiet, private gratitude that made Mercer's throat tighten unexpectedly. They rolled her out. Mercer followed until a nurse blocked him. "Family only," she said. Mercer opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He wasn't family, not by blood. But he also wasn't leaving. He stepped back just enough to let the stretcher pass, then turned and found Tessa. "She's going to be okay," he said, even though he didn't know that yet. Tessa nodded, but her eyes didn't stop scanning the corridor. "They don't like her," she whispered. "A lot of them, they say she's difficult." Mercer's voice stayed even. "What do you say?" Tessa hesitated. "I say she's the best nurse I've ever seen." Mercer looked back down the hall where Pat had disappeared. "Then why is she always alone?" he asked. Tessa's face crumpled. "Because she won't tell anyone why she knows what she knows," she said. "Because she won't." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "Because she won't tell them who she really is." Pause. The next hour stretched like a thin wire pulled too tight. Pat went through imaging, labs, observation. Mercer sat in a plastic chair under a flickering TV that was playing muted news. The anchor's mouth moved, but the words didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling in Mercer's gut that the real danger was Pat's injuries. It was the narrative forming around them. Wicks walked past twice, not looking at Mercer. On the third pass, he stopped. "Are you still here?" he asked, tone clipped. Mercer looked up. "Yes," he said. Wicks' smile was polite, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're not listed as next of kin." Mercer shrugged. "I'm not leaving." Wicks leaned slightly closer. "This is a hospital, not a base. We have procedures." Mercer's voice stayed calm. "So do we," he said. Wicks' jaw flexed. "Then you understand that interfering with staff could get you removed." Mercer stared at him for a beat. "And you understand," Mercer said, "that if you mistreat her, I will remember." Wicks let out a short laugh. Is that supposed to intimidate me? Mercer didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because right then, a tech hurried up with a clipboard, face tight. Dr. Wicks, the tech said, CT shows. He lowered his voice, but Mercer caught enough to know it wasn't good. Wicks' face changed. Not fear exactly. More like annoyance that reality had interrupted his control. He spun and walked fast toward the back. Mercer stood. Tessa stood too, eyes wide. A nurse tried to block them, but Mercer's presence, quiet, immovable, made people hesitate in a way they didn't like admitting. They reached Bay 3 again. Pat was back on the bed, her mask off now, her skin still pale. She looked like she'd been put back together just enough to function. Wicks stood at the foot of the bed with the resident beside him, both staring at a scan on a screen. Small pneumothorax, the resident said, voice careful. Not huge, but it can expand, Pat finished, voice hoarse. Wicks glanced at her, surprised she'd spoken. Pat's eyes stayed on the screen. You missed it earlier, she said. The room went quiet. Wicks' cheeks flushed. I didn't miss anything, he snapped. It wasn't visible. T was, Pat said, still calm. You didn't look. Mercer's hands curled into fists at his sides. Wicks' voice rose. You are the patient. You do not get to accuse the attending physician of negligence. Pat blinked slowly. Then do your job, she said. Camille inhaled sharply, like she couldn't believe Pat had spoken that way. The resident shifted uncomfortably. Wicks stepped forward, voice icy. If you were anyone else, I'd have you discharged for disruptive behavior. Pat's eyes flicked to Mercer just once. Then she looked back at Wicks. And if I were anyone else, she said, you'd be listening. That was when Mercer stepped in. Not between them physically, just close enough to change the air. You're proving her point, he said quietly. Wicks spun toward Mercer, eyes blazing. Get out. Mercer didn't move. You don't want an audience, Mercer continued, because you don't want witnesses. Wicks' face twisted. Security. A guard appeared at the curtain, uncertain. Wicks pointed, remove him. The guard took a step forward. Pat's voice cut through, low but firm. Stop. Everyone paused. Pat's eyes were on the guard now. If you remove him, she said, you remove my advocate. Wicks scoffed, you have no right. Pat's voice sharpened, I have every right. Wicks opened his mouth again, but the resident finally spoke up. We need to address the pneumothorax, he said. Now, this can't wait. Wicks' glare lingered on Mercer like a promise. Then he turned back to Pat, forced professionalism snapping back into place. Fine, he said. We'll place you under observation, pain control, oxygen, repeat imaging. Pat nodded once. Mercer watched her face closely. Even in pain, even pale, she looked like she was holding something in, something heavy. A secret that made everyone else's behavior look small. If you're noticing how this hospital keeps trying to shrink her, and how Mercer keeps refusing to let them, drop a like right now. It tells me you want more stories where quiet competence doesn't just survive, it wins. Pause. You might think that after catching a pneumothorax early, after Pat literally pointing out what was wrong, people would treat her with respect. But respect isn't always about facts. Sometimes it's about power. And power doesn't like being corrected by someone it considers lower. The injustice didn't come immediately. It arrived the way it usually does in real life. Through documentation. Through whispers. Through a meeting scheduled for clarification. 2 hours later, Pat was stable. Not comfortable, but stable. Wicks had left Bay 3, and another attending took over the night. The new attending, Dr. Sarah Mendel, spoke to Pat like she was a colleague, not a problem. Mercer noticed the difference instantly. Mendel asked questions. She listened to answers. She wrote down allergies without acting like it was an inconvenience. Pat's shoulders loosened by a fraction. But Wicks wasn't done. Around 2 a.m., Mercer saw him again, standing at the nurse's station with Camille and the charge nurse, a woman named Linda Orozco. Linda had been at St. Bridget's forever. She ran the floor with a practiced smile and a quiet ability to freeze people out. She didn't yell, She didn't have to. Mercer watched from across the corridor. Wicks spoke in low tones. Camille nodded too eagerly. Linda's face stayed neutral, but her eyes flicked toward Bay 3. Then Linda walked away with a clipboard. Mercer's stomach tightened. Tessa, sitting beside him, whispered, "What are they doing?" Mercer didn't answer, because he already knew. The next morning, Pat was moved to an observation room upstairs. Mercer and Tessa followed, but they weren't allowed in during shift change. From the hallway, Mercer heard voices inside. Linda's voice smooth, "Pat, this is standard." Pat's voice hoarse but steady, "This is retaliation." Wicks' voice controlled, "This is accountability." Mercer stepped closer to the door. Linda continued, "There were complaints about your behavior in the ED last night. Disruptive, insufficient respect for chain of command." Pat exhaled, "I was a patient." Wicks replied, "You were also staff. Your conduct reflects on this institution." Pat's voice went quiet, and for a second Mercer thought she might give in. Then she said, "Did anyone document the pneumothorax I identified? Or are we only documenting what protects your ego?" Silence. Mercer's hands clenched. Linda cleared her throat. "We're issuing a formal write-up," she said, "pending review." Pat's voice sharpened. "For what?" "For insubordination," Wicks said. "For undermining physician authority." Pat laughed once, soft and incredulous. "Undermining authority," she repeated, "by asking you not to injure me." Wicks' tone hardened. "You're lucky we're not suspending you." That was when Mercer pushed the door open. The room snapped silent. Pat sat up in bed, IV line taped neatly. Her hair was pulled back, face drawn from pain, but her eyes were bright with controlled fury. Wicks stood at the foot of the bed. Linda sat in a chair with a clipboard. Camille stood behind them, arms crossed, smug. Mercer's presence changed everything. Wicks' face twisted. "You again." Mercer stepped in, closing the door behind him. "You're writing her up," Mercer said. It wasn't a question. Linda lifted her eyebrows. "Sir, this is a staff matter." Mercer's voice stayed calm. "She was a patient," he said, "and you're punishing her because she embarrassed you." Wicks snapped, "That's not what this is." Pat's voice cut in quiet. "It's exactly what it is." Linda's smile tightened. "Pat, I need you to sign acknowledgement." Pat stared at the paper like it was contaminated. Mercer looked at it too, reading the top lines. "Disruptive conduct, failure to follow physician direction, creating an unsafe environment." Mercer let out a breath through his nose, slow. Unsafe environment. Like it was Wicks ignoring allergies, like it was Wicks missing a pneumothorax. Mercer looked at Pat. "Don't sign," he said. Linda's eyes narrowed. "She's required." Pat's voice was a whisper now. "If I don't sign," she said, "they'll suspend me. If I do sign, they'll say I admitted wrongdoing." Mercer's jaw tightened. "They're counting on you being tired," he said. Wicks leaned in, voice low and venomous. "And you're counting on her being a victim so you can play hero." Mercer turned his head slowly to look at Wicks. "I'm not playing," Mercer said. "I'm documenting." Wicks blinked. "Excuse me." Mercer lifted his phone, not recording, not yet but visible. "You want this quiet," he said. "I want it accurate." Linda's smile vanished. "You can't record in here." Mercer nodded. "Then stop doing things you'd be ashamed of people seeing," he said. Pat's eyes flicked to Mercer with a flash of surprise. Wicks' face reddened. "Get him out," he said. Linda stood, voice firm. "Sir, you need to leave." Mercer didn't move. Pat spoke, still quiet. "Cole," she said. Mercer looked at her. She hesitated, then said the words that felt like a door cracking open. "You don't know what you're stepping into." Mercer's voice softened. "Then tell me," he said. "Tell them, tell everyone." Pat's eyes closed for a second. When she opened them, there was something like grief in them. "I can't," she whispered. Wicks scoffed, "because there's nothing to tell." Mercer's gaze snapped back to Wicks. "Oh," Mercer said, "there's something." And that was when the nurse's station phone rang in the hallway outside, shrill and urgent. Linda paused, irritated. Camille stepped out to answer. A moment later, Camille's face drained of color. She leaned back into the room, voice barely steady. Linda, she said, administration is coming up now. Linda frowned. For what? Camille swallowed. For her. And she nodded toward Pat. Pause. The arrival wasn't dramatic in the way movies do it. No entourage bursting through the doors. No shouting. Just a quiet shift in gravity. First came the sound of shoes in the hall, measured, confident. Then a man in a dark suit stepped into the doorway, scanning the room like he already knew what he'd find. Behind him was a woman Mercer, recognized instantly from base briefings. Colonel Mariah Vance, United States Marine Corps. And she wasn't there for a charity photo. She was there like she had a problem to solve. Mercer stood automatically, spine straight, the Marine in him reacting before his mind caught up. Tessa did too, eyes wide. Wicks froze, Linda's clipboard lowered slightly. Pat didn't move. But her eyes softened with something Mercer couldn't name at first. Relief. Colonel Vance stepped into the room, gaze landing on Pat with a quiet intensity. Then she looked at Wicks. And you are, Vance asked. Wicks blinked, clearly thrown. Dr. Harlan Wicks, attending physician. Colonel Vance nodded, as if filing the name away for later. The suited man spoke. I'm Howard Rayner, Hospital Counsel, he said. We were notified of an incident involving a service member and a staff employee. Linda recovered first, putting on her smoothest tone. Colonel, this is highly unusual. Patient confidentiality. Vance cut her off with a calm, deadly politeness. I'm not here to discuss confidentiality, she said. I'm here to ensure proper care and proper process. Wicks bristled. With respect, Colonel, medical decisions are not under military jurisdiction. Vance's eyes didn't flicker. With respect, doctor, I haven't offered a medical decision yet. That line landed like a weight. Mercer felt it in his chest. So did everyone else. Rayner looked at Pat. Ms. Patel, he said, careful with the name, we understand you were involved in a motor vehicle collision and brought here for treatment. Pat nodded once. Rayner continued, we also understand there may have been workplace conflict during the course of your care. Wicks' jaw tightened. This is being exaggerated. Vance's gaze snapped to him. Were you present during her intake? She asked. Wicks hesitated. Yes. Did you document her allergies immediately? Vance asked. Wicks' eyes flashed. Did you? Vance repeated, voice still calm. The resident, who had quietly entered behind them, looked like he wanted to disappear. Wicks forced a smile. The team documented appropriately. Vance nodded slowly, then turned to Pat. Lieutenant, she said. The room stopped breathing. Even Mercer felt his mind stutter. Lieutenant. Pat's eyes closed for a second. Then she opened them and looked directly at Vance. Yes, ma'am, she said. Linda's clipboard slipped a fraction. Camille's mouth fell open. Wicks blinked hard, like his brain couldn't process the words. Rayner's expression turned carefully neutral. Mercer felt a slow, cold satisfaction spread through him. Because now it made sense. The dog tags. The Navy captain calling her ma'am. The way she carried herself. Pat wasn't just a nurse. She was a commissioned officer. And she'd been letting them treat her like she was nothing. Vance's voice softened slightly. Are you in pain? She asked. Pat nodded. Yes, ma'am. Are you receiving appropriate care? Vance asked. Pat's eyes flicked toward Wicks, then back. Dr. Mendel has been professional, she said. The conflict is separate. Wicks exhaled sharply, like he'd been spared. But Vance wasn't done. She turned to Linda. And you are? She asked. Linda cleared her throat. Linda Orozco, charge nurse. Vance nodded. Ms. Orozco, she said, why is there a disciplinary document on that bed? Linda's smile tightened. That's internal. Vance leaned in just slightly. Answer the question, she said. Linda swallowed. It's a write-up for conduct. Vance's eyes narrowed. For a patient, she said, voice flat. Wicks stepped in defensive. She's also an employee. Her behavior undermined care. Pat's voice cut in, quiet but firm. I asked you not to administer something I'm allergic to, she said. The resident flinched. Wicks snapped, that's not what happened. Vance's gaze turned to the resident. Doctor, she said gently, what is your name? The resident stammered it. Vance nodded. Did Lieutenant Patel state she had allergies? Vance asked. The resident swallowed. Yes, ma'am, he admitted, she did. Did she request no contrast? Vance asked. Yes, the resident said, voice small. Was a pneumothorax identified after imaging? Vance asked. The resident nodded, yes. And did she indicate concern about it before it was addressed? Vance asked. The resident hesitated. Wicks stared at him like a blade. The resident's voice cracked slightly. Yes, he said. Silence. Vance straightened. That's what I needed, she said. If you felt that shift, if you just felt the room change with one word, Lieutenant, comment below with what you think is going to happen to Dr. Wicks now. And stay with me because the real reveal about Pat is even bigger than her rank. Pause. Pat's full name, Mercer learned in that moment, wasn't just Pat. It was Lieutenant Priya Patel. And that wasn't even the part that made the room tilt. Because lieutenant could mean a lot of things. Reserve, Medical Corps, administrative. But Colonel Vance didn't look at her like she was a junior officer doing weekend drills. Vance looked at her like she was someone who carried weight. Rayner cleared his throat. Colonel, he said carefully, the hospital needs to understand what. Vance held up a hand. You'll understand soon, she said. For now, I want all documentation related to last night's intake, including medication orders, allergy documentation timing, and staff communication logs. Linda's eyes widened. That will take. It will take as long as it takes, Vance said, and you will not alter anything. Wicks bristled. This is absurd, you can't come in here and... Vance's gaze locked onto him. Doctor, she said, are you familiar with the term sentinel event? Wicks stiffened. Vance continued, voice still controlled. Are you familiar with the legal consequences of retaliatory discipline against an employee who advocated for patient safety? Rayner shifted uncomfortably. Linda's hands tightened on the clipboard. Camille looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. Pat stayed still, eyes lowered now like she wanted none of this, like she wanted the oxygen of anonymity back. Mercer felt a sudden surge of respect that had nothing to do with rank. She'd been letting them hit her with humiliation because she didn't want to weaponize who she was. That kind of restraint wasn't weakness. It was discipline. Vance turned to Pat again. Lieutenant Patel, she said, softer, I'm sorry it had to come to this. Pat's voice was barely audible. I tried to handle it quietly. Why, she said. Vance nodded. I know, she said, and that's why I'm here. Mercer's brow furrowed. How did Vance know? Rayner looked at his tablet. We received a call, he said, from... He stopped, glancing at Pat as if weighing what he could say. Vance finished it for him. From Naval Medical Command, she said. Wick's face went blank. Naval, he repeated, like the word didn't belong here. Vance's voice was steady. Lieutenant Patel is not just a nurse employed by St. Bridget S., she said. She is also an active-duty Navy nurse assigned to a joint program with the Marines. Her presence here is part of a formal partnership. Linda's lips parted. Active duty, she whispered. Wick's voice went sharp. Then why was she working here like staff? Pat finally looked up, eyes hard now. Because I wanted to understand civilian trauma care, she said. Because I wanted to serve where the need was, and because I didn't want special treatment. Wick scoffed. Special treatment, he repeated. Is that what this is? Mercer stepped closer, voice low. No, he said. This is consequences. Vance's gaze flicked to Mercer. Staff Sergeant Mercer, she said. Mercer froze. She knew his name, too. Yes, ma'am, he replied automatically. Vance nodded slightly. You were the one who insisted she speak, Vance said. Mercer swallowed. Yes, ma'am. Vance's eyes held his. Thank you, she said simply. It wasn't dramatic, but it hit Mercer harder than any medal ceremony ever had. Rayner cleared his throat again. Colonel, we need to move this into a formal review. The hospital has its own. Vance interrupted. You will, she said, and so will we. Wick's voice rose. This is a witch hunt. Pat's voice cut in, calm and precise. No, she said, it's an audit. And that one word, audit, made Linda flinch because it meant paper trails, timestamps, witnesses. It meant the truth, written down in ink where ego couldn't overwrite it. Pause. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a conference room with bad coffee and a window that looked out on the same glossy lobby fountain. It happened with policies open on laptops, with printed forms, with staff statements collected like evidence. It happened the way justice usually happens when it's real. Procedural, uncomfortable, undeniable. Pat wasn't even present at first. She was upstairs under observation, receiving care. Dr. Mendel had insisted on it. But Colonel Vance sat at the head of the table like she owned the air. Hospital Counsel Rayner sat beside her, trying to keep everything civil. Linda Orozco sat stiff-backed, clipboard replaced by a legal pad. Camille sat near the end, eyes flicking constantly to Wicks. And Dr. Harlan Wicks sat with his arms folded, face set in practiced indignation. Mercer was there too, not because he'd forced his way in, but because Vance had requested his statement. Tessa sat beside Mercer, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Rayner opened. We're here to review allegations regarding last night's events, he said, voice controlled. This includes patient safety concerns and staff conduct issues. Wicks smirked slightly, like he believed this would end with him being cleared. Vance looked at Rayner. Start with timestamps, she said. Rayner nodded and projected a timeline. Medication orders entered at 23:41. Allergy documentation updated at 23:57. Contrast order placed at 23:44. Pat's verbal allergy note, documented by the resident at 23:42 but flagged late. The room got quiet. Vance's voice was calm. Dr. Wicks, she said, why was contrast ordered 2 minutes after the patient verbalized concern? Wicks' jaw tightened. Because we needed imaging, he said. Time is critical. Vance nodded. And allergies, she asked. Wicks shrugged. We address them as we can. Mercer's fists clenched under the table. Tessa's breath caught. Vance didn't react emotionally. She simply looked at Linda. Ms. Orozco, Vance said, why was a write-up drafted for the patient before the care timeline was fully reviewed? Linda's eyes darted. It was based on reports of disruptive behavior, she said. Vance's gaze narrowed. Reports from whom? Linda hesitated. From staff. Vance nodded. Names, she said. Linda's cheeks flushed. Camille reported it, she admitted. Camille stiffened. She was disrespectful, Camille blurted. She acted like she was above the doctor. Mercer's voice stayed quiet. She acted like she wanted to not be harmed, he said. Camille's eyes snapped to him. You don't understand, she snapped. She's always correcting people like she's perfect. Tessa's voice shook. She is perfect, she said, then caught herself embarrassed. I mean, she's careful, she's safe. Rayner held up a hand. Let's keep this professional. Vance leaned forward. Professional is exactly what we're here to discuss, she said. She turned to Wicks. Tor, Vance said. How many complaints have been made about Lieutenant Patel in the last year? Wicks' eyes narrowed. I don't know. Rayner looked uncomfortable. There are several informal notes, he admitted. Vance nodded. And how many patient safety commendations has she received? Rayner blinked. I'd have to check. Vance's tone didn't change. Check, she said. Rayner tapped on his tablet. His expression shifted. She has multiple written commendations, he said slowly. From patients, from paramedics, even from physicians in other departments. Wick's mouth tightened. Vance looked around the room. So the pattern is this, she said. When she corrects someone in the interest of safety, she is labeled disruptive. When she is quiet, she is ignored. And when she is correct, credit is taken. No one spoke. Because it was true. And truth has a way of making people feel exposed. Then Vance delivered the part that made Wick's confidence finally crack. Lieutenant Patel, Vance said, is also a recipient of the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for life-saving. Wicks blinked. That's not relevant. Vance's eyes hardened. It's relevant, she said, because it means her decisions under pressure have been evaluated at the highest level. Linda's pen stopped moving. Camille's face went pale. Mercer felt his throat tighten again. Vance continued. She has served in forward trauma settings. She has trained medics. She has been the calm in rooms where people were bleeding out. Her voice stayed clean, non-graphic, but the weight of it settled on everyone. And here, Vance said softly, she was nearly harmed by ego and then disciplined for speaking up. Wick's voice rose, defensive. This is absurd. You're making me the villain because she has military credentials. Vance shook her head once. No, she said, you made yourself a risk by refusing to listen. Pause. The consequences didn't come as a dramatic firing on the spot. They came as a chain reaction. First, the write-up was formally withdrawn. Rayner stated it plainly, legal language clipped. The disciplinary action will be rescinded pending further review, he said. Linda's face stayed stiff, but her eyes flickered with fear now. Then Vance asked for witness statements. The resident provided his, the paramedic provided his, Dr. Mendel provided hers. Each statement was calm, factual, and devastating. The resident admitted Pat's allergy warning came before the contrast order. The paramedic confirmed Pat had insisted on no contrast in transport. Dr. Mendel noted that Pat's concerns were clinically appropriate, and that retaliatory discipline posed a chilling effect on safety reporting. That phrase, chilling effect, made Rayner wince. That was lawsuit language, that was accreditation language. Wick sat straighter, but the polish was slipping. Linda attempted a pivot. Pat has interpersonal issues, she said. She creates tension. Vance tilted her head slightly. Tell me what she did, she said, specifically. Linda hesitated. Camille jumped in. She corrects people in front of others, Camille said, voice tight. She makes them look stupid. Mercer's voice was still quiet. She makes them look careless, he corrected. Camille snapped her eyes to him. You don't work here. Mercer leaned back, controlled. No, he said. I just recognize bullying when I see it. Rayner cleared his throat. We should be careful with. Vance lifted a hand. No, she said, we should be accurate. Then Vance said something that made the room go colder. Lieutenant Patel has been documenting, she said. Wick's eyes widened a fraction. Documenting what? Vance's gaze stayed on him. Patterns, she said. Medication overrides, dismissed allergy notes, public humiliations in front of junior staff, comments about her being difficult. Linda's lips parted. That's. Vance leaned in slightly. She kept receipts, she said. Mercer felt a slow, fierce satisfaction. Because Pat hadn't been silent because she was weak. She'd been silent because she was gathering facts. Wick's voice rose. This is outrageous. If she had concerns, she should have reported them. Vance's eyes didn't blink. She did, she said, quietly, repeatedly. Rayner's face tightened. Colonel, if there were prior reports we need. Vance nodded. You will receive them, she said, along with a notification to your accrediting body if obstruction occurs. That was the moment Wick's mask finally cracked. His voice sharpened into something less polished. So what? He snapped. We're supposed to treat her like she's special because she's military. Vance's voice stayed calm. No, she said. You're supposed to treat her like she's competent because she's competent. Silence. Mercer looked at Tessa. She was crying quietly, not from sadness now, but from that strange relief that comes when someone finally says the truth out loud. If you've ever watched someone good get punished for being good, I want you to comment with the word witness. Not for drama, just to mark that you were here for the moment the paper trail finally caught up. Pause. Pat was discharged later that afternoon with strict instructions, a follow-up plan, and a quiet note from Dr. Mendel that simply read, You were right to speak. Mercer walked with her to the exit. The lobby fountain kept running, indifferent. Pat moved carefully, arm in a sling, steps measured. She didn't look triumphant. She looked exhausted. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean, like the city had washed itself. Mercer stopped near the curb where cars pulled up. Pat looked at him, expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Mercer's voice was gentle. "Yeah," he said, "I did." Pat's eyes narrowed slightly, almost amused. "Why?" she asked. Mercer hesitated, then chose honesty. "Because I've seen people like Wicks," he said. "They don't hate you, they hate what you represent, someone they can't control." Pat's gaze dropped to the pavement. "I didn't want my rank to be part of it," she said. Mercer nodded. "I know," he said, "but they forced it." Pat exhaled. "They've been trying to force it for a year," she admitted. "They want me to either play their game or leave." Mercer looked at her. "So why stay?" he asked. Pat's voice was quiet. "Because patients don't get to choose the politics," she said. "They just need someone who will do the right thing." Mercer felt his throat tighten again. And that's when the lobby doors opened behind them. Linda Orozco stepped out. She looked different now, smaller, as if the sunlight had stolen her confidence. Pat turned slowly. Linda cleared her throat. "Pat," she said, voice strained, I wanted to say." Pat held up a hand. Linda froze. Pat's eyes were steady. "Don't," she said softly. Linda swallowed. "They're reviewing the department," she whispered. They're looking at everything. Wicks is furious." Pat nodded once. "Good," she said. Linda's eyes flicked to Mercer. "You," she said quietly, "you made it worse." Mercer stared at her. "No," he said, "you did." Linda's face tightened. She looked at Pat again, voice small. "They said you're going back to the Navy," she said. Pat's voice was calm. "I never left," she replied. Linda flinched. Pat shifted her sling slightly, winced, then looked straight at Linda. "You wanted me to be small," Pat said, "so you could feel big." Linda's eyes watered. "I was trying to keep order," she whispered. Pat's gaze didn't soften. "Order without integrity is just control," she said. Linda stood there for a moment, then turned and walked back inside. Mercer watched her go. Then he looked at Pat. "You ready?" he asked. Pat nodded, but her eyes were distant. "Cole," she said quietly, "you told me to tell them who I really am." Mercer met her gaze. "Yeah," he said. Pat's voice dropped, and for the first time there was a hint of emotion in it. Not melodrama, just truth. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm tired of being quiet." Mercer nodded once. "Then don't be," he said. Pat's gaze lifted, and she looked at the hospital, at the glass and the fountain and the polished floors. Then she said, softly, like she was making a promise to herself, "They'll know." Pause. The final vindication didn't happen in the conference room. It happened a week later. St. Bridget's held a mandatory staff meeting in the auditorium, the same one with donor plaques and soft lighting, designed to make bad news feel less harsh. Pat was still recovering, but she came anyway, arm in sling, posture straight. Mercer sat in the back row with Tessa, both in civilian clothes. Wicks stood at the front, face set, jaw tight. Hospital Counsel Rayner stood beside the CEO, a woman with a voice like polished steel. Colonel Vance sat in the front row, uniform crisp, presence unmistakable. The CEO spoke first. She didn't dramatize, she didn't accuse. She read facts. She stated that an internal review had found procedural deviations in patient intake documentation. She stated that retaliatory discipline had been improperly initiated. She stated that staff training would be mandatory. And then she said the words that made the room hum with shock. "Dr. Harlan Wicks has been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation." A ripple ran through the auditorium. Wicks' face went rigid. Camille's hand flew to her mouth. Linda stared at her lap. The CEO continued. "Additionally, we are recognizing exemplary conduct under pressure demonstrated by Nurse Priya Patel." Pat's shoulders stiffened. Mercer felt his chest tighten. The CEO turned toward Pat. "Ms. Patel," she said, "please stand." Pat stood slowly. The room looked at her. And in that gaze Mercer saw everything Pat had endured. Dismissal, whispers, isolation. Then Colonel Vance stood too. And the room changed. Because people recognized that posture, that crispness, that gravity. Vance faced Pat. In front of everyone, Colonel Vance raised her hand and rendered a salute. It was clean, sharp, respectful. Pat froze. The auditorium fell so silent, you could hear the HVAC system breathing. Wicks stared like he'd been punched without being touched. And then Pat, arm in sling and all, shifted carefully and returned the salute as best she could. Not flashy, not performative, just correct, just real. That was the moment the title promise landed. Tell them who you really are. Not with shouting, not with threats, with dignity, with proof, with a simple gesture that said, you misjudged her and now you have to live with it. And that's when the room changed. Not because Pat suddenly became worthy, because everyone finally realized she always had been. If you want more stories where the quiet professional finally gets seen, hit subscribe right now. And when you do, tell me in the comments what you'd have done if you were Pat. Stay quiet or speak up sooner. Pause. After the meeting, people approached Pat in small, cautious groups. A respiratory therapist thanked her for standing up. A paramedic nodded once and said, "Knew you were solid." A young nurse, someone Pat had trained months earlier, started crying and said, "I thought I was crazy for noticing what they did to you." Pat didn't bask. She didn't lecture. She just listened, and every now and then she nodded like she was finally letting herself be human in front of them. Mercer watched from a distance, not inserting himself. Tessa stood beside him, whispering, "I can't believe they treated her like that." Mercer's voice was quiet. "I can," he said. "People don't always punish weakness. Sometimes they punish strength they don't understand." Tessa looked at him. "What happens now?" she asked. Mercer watched Pat as Colonel Vance spoke to her briefly, then handed her a folder, sealed, official. Pat's face tightened as she read it, then she exhaled slowly. "She's leaving," Mercer realized aloud. Tessa's eyes widened, "Leaving the hospital." Mercer nodded. "Back to where she can do the most good," he said. A few minutes later, Pat walked toward them. Her face was tired but lighter somehow, like she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying alone. She stopped in front of Mercer. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she said, "You were right." Mercer blinked. "About what?" he asked. Pat's eyes held his. "About witnesses," she said, "about not letting them bury it." Mercer nodded once. Pat's voice softened. "I spent a year trying to be invisible," she said. "I thought it would keep the peace, but it didn't. It just gave them room." Mercer's voice was gentle. "Peace without respect isn't peace," he said. Pat let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh if it wasn't so tired. Then she looked at Tessa. "Thank you," Pat said. Tessa shook her head quickly. "No," she said, voice trembling. "Thank you, you made me brave." Pat's eyes softened just slightly. "Good," she said, "keep that." Colonel Vance called Pat's name from the aisle. Pat turned, then looked back at Mercer one last time. "You told me to tell them who I really am," she said. Mercer nodded. "Yeah," he said. Pat's gaze sharpened with quiet authority. "Next time," she said, "I won't wait for someone else to demand it." Mercer felt something in his chest loosen, like a knot finally undone. Pat walked away toward Colonel Vance, sling and all, spine straight. And Mercer watched the crowd part for her without anyone needing to be told. Because now they knew. Pause. Weeks later, Mercer received a small envelope in his base mailbox. No return address, just his name written neatly. Inside was a single card. "Thank you for seeing me before they did." No rank, no title. Just Priya. Mercer sat at his desk, holding the card longer than he meant to. He thought about Pat on that stretcher, Pat refusing to weaponize her identity, Pat taking humiliation because she believed in service more than ego. He thought about Wicks, how easy it was for someone like that to rise when the system rewarded confidence over competence. And he thought about the salute, how one gesture had restored something the hospital had tried to strip away. Dignity. That night, Mercer went for a run along the edge of base, the ocean air cold in his lungs. He didn't run to escape. He ran to remember. Because sometimes the best people don't announce themselves. Sometimes they just keep doing the right thing until the world is forced to catch up. And that's when the room changes. Before you go, take a second to watch the next story on the channel. Another fictional case where the person everyone underestimated turns out to be the one holding the whole place together. And if you want to keep riding that feeling of justice and vindication, subscribe so you don't miss it.